Welcome back, everyone. It's the fifth episode of the BE Chamber podcast, and we're super excited to be back. And it has been a really interesting time for us. We've got a lot happening at the BE Chamber. We've just completed our fourth episode. Now we're starting to move over to our fifth episode. And I'm here with one of my colleagues at the BE Chamber, Frick. He is our human capital specialist at the BE Chamber. Frick, welcome. Thank you so much for having you on the BE Chamber podcast. How are you doing? Are you well?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm well. Thank you, Neil.
All right, No, great stuff. Yes, I'm good, and it's great to have you here. But Frick, we want to talk about employment equity today. It's a very, very hot topic that's happening over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of talks, a lot of discussions, a lot of consultations happening within internal organizations on this topic. But before we get into that, tell us a bit about yourself, your history, what you do at the Chamber. It's always good to understand where you're coming from in the space of employment equity. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Right. Okay, so I would say after I studied, went to the army. Just interesting side fact, nothing to do with equity. So then I studied, obviously I went to university, I studied in psychology, and then through having met some people in the transformation industry, in employment equity skills development, I then moved into this industry. In my own business first, and then eventually joined the Chamber as part of the members here. So I've consulted many years, since probably about 2001, on equity. It's been a lot of movement over the years, but yeah, that's sort of my background here.
No, awesome. And just let's get into this topic of employment equity. What is it? What exactly does employment equity mean?
Okay, so I'm going to refer back to the Employment Equity Act and the purpose of it. So when I speak to clients, when I do training, it's one of the things that I emphasize all the time, is that whatever we do in terms of equity has got to relate back to the purpose of the Act. The purpose of the Act is twofold. The one is we need to eliminate unfair discrimination, and the second part is to implement affirmative action. So to redress the disadvantages experienced by people in the past. So employment equity is then about those two things. And when we use the term an equitable organization, that means that they are aligned to EAP. So our benchmark in terms of transformation in the country, when the department also speaks about transformation, they refer to EAP alignment. So when we say a company is equitable, we really mean that the demographics per employment equity level are aligned to the demographics of the working population of South Africa.
No, definitely. And you touched on a very important concept, and it's also good for our viewers to understand this concept of EAP. What exactly does it mean, and why is it so important for our country? Why are we trying to achieve it? Maybe if you can share a bit about EAP, I think it's a very important concept to understand as South Africans.
Yeah. So the idea is that because in our history certain groups have been excluded, that we make sure that we equal the playing fields, so that all groups can participate equally in line with the demographics of those groups. So we've got majority African in South Africa, but in the workplace, if you look at top senior middle management specifically, there's huge underrepresentation of African people. If you look at the demographics, the same for coloured, also for Indian, there's certain levels where there's significant underrepresentation. So the idea is to say that certain groups have been excluded in our history, therefore we need to rectify that by bringing all of those groups into the fold and give everybody the same amount of opportunity to be able to participate.
No, definitely. I think that's one of the key areas of focus from the Department of Employment and Equity and Labour, or the Department of Labour. And they are obviously driving this notion of companies to then focus on reaching EAP. But the question to that is it possible? Is it possible to reach those levels of EAP in South Africa?
I think so. The comment from the department when originally we started talking about the amendments, in the communication to South Africans, it was that the pace of transformation has been too slow. So we've had this act since 1998. If you think about something like African male representation at top management at about 10%, now 26 years later, I do agree, and I'm just using African males because they come first in the sequence on the table. But the same applies to African females. We're on about 6%, I think, compared to the EAP of 37%. So the question is then valid. Is it then possible if we haven't managed it in 26 years? And that's why the amendments are coming in to accelerate the pace of transformation through some changes in the legislation. So I do think it's possible. What the department communicated was that companies have not focused on it well enough. They've set low targets that they've reached, but the targets are so low that they're not really moving companies towards that. So yes, I think it's possible. I think we do need to be realistic that how soon can we achieve the alignment, specifically at the higher levels. The Act also talks about suitably qualified individuals. So it's not about just putting people in positions for the sake of having the right demographics. It's about having suitably qualified people there. And that takes time. But I think companies don't often use succession planning well. They don't really develop people in terms of leadership for people to be ready to go into those positions. So long answer to a short question, which is yes, I think it's possible, but there needs to be a much more concerted effort to be able to reach those.
And that's really important what you just mentioned, that concerted effort. And in a few of our podcast sessions, I even talked about people being decision makers, meaning that you're either going to be the person or the individual that's going to make a decision to drive this concerted effort towards achieving EAP as an organization as well as feeding into the country. So just on that, do you still see a lot of barriers? And if so, what are those barriers for companies to just move towards that EAP direction? You mentioned setting up low targets and reaching those low targets. Is that a barrier because they are setting up low targets, or is it just something that they feel like we can only achieve this, let us set a target and let us work towards that? Or are there other barriers as well?
So my main role within the chamber is, if I have to put it in layman's terms, is to identify who are the different stakeholders that make decisions within the business that affect our transformation within that business. And typically companies look to HR to get the business transformed. But HR does not make many HR decisions. Ultimately, it's the line managers that make the decisions. So they need to be on board, and very often that's where there's a bit of a barrier. So sometimes in terms of not wanting to, other times about not having been educated or not having been motivated to actually do that. If you think about the concept of change management, if people don't want to change, they will not change. So you've got to overcome that hurdle. So that on the one hand, in line management, I think we haven't put the emphasis and the ownership for transformation in the hands of the right people in many businesses. And then also leadership. With change, if you're going to see a change, the top leadership of a business, that's going to be really important, how they lead the change as well. And so we talk there about KPIs needing to be throughout the business with all decision makers and all of those that need to drive it. And there are subconscious drivers as well. I always, when I do committee training and other engagements with companies, it's also for me about, I talk about what we need to approach. The approach should be at the heart of transformation is a change of heart. So we can chase the numbers and all of those things, but what about us wanting to become more aware if I'm a line manager and I'm interviewing someone? Am I aware of my unconscious bias, my stereotypes that if I bring someone in within 7 seconds, I've made up my mind about that person? Am I aware of those things as a line manager, because I could be discriminating? And those are so there's overt barriers, things that are very obvious, and then there's more subconscious, unconscious barriers, and I think we need a lot more awareness amongst the decision makers again about the impact.
And I think it goes back to the point of education within organizations and continuously upscaling individuals that are going to be dealing with these different areas, making decisions that have impacts on driving towards EAP. And the education is super, super important when you look at a situation where you mentioned subconscious and also being subconscious bias and also not being aware of certain things. I think we need to be more aware of certain things when we're making decisions within organizations. And the only way we're going to get to that is by education, education, education. So Farouk, thanks for that. I mean, you have touched on a few of the barriers and they're very valid and they're very interesting to hear, especially with your experience dealing with a lot of organizations. I want to then move on to the Employment Equity Act and the amendments. You know that there's been, over the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of noise being made around this space. We've got a new Employment Equity Act that has not been implemented as yet, as in it's not been yet signed off with the implementation date. As well as we've got regulations that were released earlier this year in the form of draft. We've then also had the commentary period lapsed, and now we're at a point of just waiting in respect of seeing if there's going to be implementation around the regulations. What are your thoughts around this space, considering that the Act is not being implemented as yet, the regulations have not been signed off for implementation, which brings about sectorial targets for organizations? Do you think we're going to see any movement this year? What are your thoughts on the space?
So I can put my head on a block about this year. So pretty sure not this year.
Okay.
And that's simply because we've already now gone into a reporting period. So if companies will have to develop new plans once we have a final implementation date, effective date. So only once we've had those plans in place can we then report on new plans. So this round of reporting is against old plans, if I can call it that way. So it won't be this year. So we might get the effective date this year sometime, but we won't start implementing yet. So that effective date will not be in this year. We're middle of October, so pretty sure not this year.
Yes.
There were some road shows towards the end of September, and the feedback from the department is also, it's very unclear. There's no indication of when it might be. So yeah, not this year, maybe next year.
Maybe next year.
I think so.
Look, I think timing is really essential because we now at a point in time where companies are making submissions of EE reporting to your EA2, EA4s, reporting to the Department of Employment and Labour right now. So timing is not good right now to allow for implementation of the Act as well as the regulations and introducing sectorial targets. So I think we might see something, next year. I'm on the same page with you. I don't think anything's going to happen this year. But we never know. We never know. There might be something that will pop up that will then creep in before the end of the year, then maybe setting up the implementation or something for the new year. So it's pretty exciting times around your space, and I think a lot of companies are just keeping tabs on this space, especially with what the Act is introducing in terms of fines, in terms of transgressions or punitive actions against companies that do not meet requirements. Do you foresee in the future with the Act coming into play that companies are going to be really focused on making sure that they don't transgress anything within the Act? Do you see that happening?
I have been really busy in the last couple of years, specifically on employment equity. So that's not the core of my role within the chamber. But there's just been so much work in that space, and I think the amendments coming in has really stirred things up, and a lot of awareness around this. So I do think what I find is it depends on the size of the business. Your big corporates that are out there in the media consistently, and as soon as something goes wrong, they'll be in the media in a bad way. So in terms of that, the big corporates are really aligned and they do what they need to do. It's with smaller businesses, I think, that there's not always the awareness again, and or the commitment to implementing this.
Yeah, I think organizations will approach, the new Employment Equity Act as well as the regulations in a manner that obviously is beneficial to them as a business, but also looking at themselves as South African businesses and operating in South Africa, wanting to be those good corporate citizens. And that's something that I think everyone would welcome, whether it would be the public sector, the private sector, the individual, the layman, they would all want to welcome, that good corporate citizenship by companies and the way they operate. So just moving to a slightly different topic, but still within your field, you do a lot of employment equity training and also employment equity committee training for organizations. What does that actually entail? As in, what do you go through, very briefly, what do you go through with the organization, with the individuals? What do you actually talk about in those sessions?
So the crux of it is we want to get to a point where the committee understands their role in terms of employment equity. Where do they fit in? So usually that's why I get to do the training, is because there's a gap in terms of them understanding. So I always use the comment that there's no point getting together, having nice biscuits and coffee, and everybody goes their separate ways, and there's no proper impact, and that's also disheartening. You don't want to be part of a body where there's actually nothing happening. So that's where we want to head towards. But to get there, we need to the committee members need to understand firstly what's the context. Why do we need to implement affirmative action in South Africa? Why do we need to eliminate unfair discrimination? A bit around our history and the impact of that still today. Because that then gets us to the point where we say, if the purpose of the act is eliminate unfair discrimination, implement affirmative action, why did we get this act in the first place? Is it still relevant? To position that, and then we go into the details of what does the Act now say. Who are the designated groups, the groups that have been discriminated against in the past that we need to implement affirmative action for. We look at what is fair discrimination, unfair discrimination, but then the focus comes into the duties of a designated employer, where it is you need to have a plan, you need to report, you need to do an analysis, you have to have a committee, all of those things, and then to position the committee within that process of implementing affirmative action and employment equity.
That sounds very interesting, and I mean, this is a question for you as a self-assessment. Have you been successful in terms of the training and in terms of employment equity committee training? As in, you have your sessions with organizations, do they actually take that knowledge and implement?
I hope so. I do think that, on the one hand, change is a slow process. So I think it does take time, but usually the feedback at the end is that it's been an eye-opener, because that's really what you want to achieve, for people to understand what is this all about, where does it come from, and typically people would then say that it has been an eye-opener, they are now more aware. We also go through an agenda of a recommended agenda. So if you are having your committee meetings, what are the things that you should be discussing? So hopefully that then when I leave, that stays behind with them and they go and implement. So there are some companies where I walk a road, in terms of providing updates regularly at the meetings of how they are accomplishing the objectives of their plans. And there you do see the change. You can see, you need to refresh all the time. Something like EAP, you hear it once on a day. It's got to be consistently reinforced, even with the committee. Otherwise, it just, it fades away after.
No, of course. And the reason for the question of why I asked such a question is that in our last episode we spoke about race and heritage. And we as individuals, especially in South Africa, we are such a diverse country compared to the globe, where we see different people in terms of the way that we look in South Africa. And we all come from different backgrounds in terms of our upbringing. Now to train individuals that are all coming from different backgrounds with different trains of thoughts, to then bring them together to have some sort of consensus moving forward is not the easiest task. And hence I asked, do you think we're successful, or are organizations listening? And I think that it's important that it is an eye-opener. I think it's a starting point, and people are starting to see that this is the direction that we need to go in terms of meeting our goals as organizations. But on that note, do you find that consensus in committees are one of the biggest challenges?
It depends on the environment. So, you know, if you're talking to a finance company versus a mine versus manufacturing, it would really vary from, and you've got different types of people in each of those different types of areas. So the types of conversations can be quite different depending on those environments. Also, if it's unionized versus non-unionized committee, or you know, if there's committee representation from the unions, then that would also impact whether you know, the type of conversations that you would have. So it can't be a blanket statement in terms of, you know, what the subscription really looks like and the types of conversations that will be.
No, understood. I think every industry, every organization operating in different industries at different scales will have its own unique challenges, its own goals, what it needs to achieve. So there would be different discussions. I'm just thinking that, you know, we're bringing about so many different diverse people within a room. Might be sometimes challenging to get, you know, movement going forward. But I guess it's the process. The process needs to continue, and I think the reinforcement of having these sessions, going through the discussions and making sure that the education is there, you're going to be moving slowly but surely. I want to then come to a topic that you might be touching on quite frequently within your sessions with companies. The topic of race, gender, designated groups, people with disabilities, all of these different concepts obviously come up within your discussions within training or just generally meeting with companies on this topic of the Employment Equity Committee. From your perspective, what would be the topic that is spoken about the most? I'm assuming it's the racial component, am I correct?
Yeah, so I try and steer the conversation away from just race. But when you say the word, I always say, when I say the word discrimination, what comes to mind?
Race.
It's always race first, and that's in everybody's minds. And that's just because of, it's out there. There's a lot of talk around that in the media.
And our history.
And our history, obviously, yes, as well. So then we maybe think about gender, and then nobody really thinks about disability. So that's, for instance, one of the things that I then emphasize is it's not just about race. There's been discrimination. If you think about the designated groups, Africans, Coloureds, Indians, women in general, and people with disabilities, those groups have all been discriminated against, and therefore we need to implement affirmative action for all those groups. But yes, the race comes up a lot. I try and open up the conversation to get people to talk about their experiences, because if you start thinking about this, each of us, even me as a white person, have been discriminated against, not as a white person, but based on something else. It just happens everywhere. So to also then get the conversation, women in this room, what have your experiences been in terms of this? People with disabilities, very misunderstood in terms of what their experiences are. So to try and open up those conversations as well.
Okay. So, I mean, there are various aspects that need to be focused on, and you've mentioned them. It's not only the racial component. But when we talk about this concept of race, what's your viewpoint on understanding race in South Africa, or just generally? What do you understand by that concept?
Well, that's a very broad question. And so I have an interesting conversation always, just to get people thinking about what are we talking about here. My question then goes something like, I start the session with, what is your race? It's like, you know, people's faces like, who's this guy? He's starting out with, what's my race? Yeah. But then go into the conversation, so how do you know that? How do you know that that's actually your race? And talking about it scientifically, that what is race actually, and we are much more the same than what we are different, yet we have used the external to then say certain groups of people are inferior or superior based on the external. And then get to the point where we say, then if we're going to say that certain groups need to be included more, then what is the reason for that? And that's because the history has used the external to actually discriminate against people. And so, as a scientific concept, it doesn't really exist. If you think about, we've all got internal organs, eyes, ears, faces, whatever, and that's, science has shown us that there's much more similarity than differences. Yet, we do need to look at race because certain groups have been discriminated against in terms of that.
Yeah, I guess, it's definitely from a society perspective in our history in terms of individuals that have made decisions to say that we need to segregate. We need to then look at certain people in certain ways based on the factors of the way that they look. And we need to segregate, we need to separate people because of that. And that's, I think, something that everybody, even the individual that is just, looking at a person, they automatically judge this person based on their race, or they identify this person by their race. And I guess it's just the history that we have, what we've been taught, how we've been taught within our own country, and just generally, we do see race, we do see that often, and we do identify with it. But as per your, example that you mentioned, the scientific component is that we're all very similar as in being human beings, as in individuals. But I guess our history and what we've learned is we see people doing that in that form. It's quite interesting. So in our last session, we did mention that we need to speak about the concept of race a lot more, especially within your areas of work. I think it's very good to have those discussions at those platforms. It does then help move the process for organizations to achieve their goals. But just zoning in very briefly on the woman component as well as the designated group component. You mentioned that you like to steer into that direction. What's kind of the feedback when you bring up that type of topic? Is there a big focus, or is it just by the way we need to look at this area?
So in the conversations, again, if I open up the conversation in terms of, I try also to get people to share their own experiences. So the idea is to get people to understand that there's discrimination against all groups, and I might have added in terms of gender or race or whatever the case may be, or religion or sexual orientation or whatever it is. But in terms of gender then, I would say the comment that I hear the most when I have that conversation is that women have the sense that they have to outperform men to be seen as equals. That they would be in a meeting and be ignored, and then have very good ideas, and a week later the male says the same thing, and suddenly it's the best idea ever. And that's sort of the experience. So I try and make it very real as opposed to just theoretical, yes, we need to empower women, etc., etc. But what's their real experience? And that's sort of the feedback that I'm getting.
No, great stuff. Fred, it's been a pleasure having this discussion with you. Any last words for our members or for the viewers out there that you want to share very briefly in terms of employment equity, anything that you would like to share?
So I think that let's just bring the conversation back again to at the heart of transformation is a change of heart, because we can address this we need to comply, otherwise we're going to get a big stick through a fine. But what's it really about? It would be about things like look at yourself. What change can you make in the world? Guard against your own stereotypes, because you might be discriminating without even realizing it. So, excuse me, get back from just the technical compliance into why are we doing this? What's actually going on here? And change how we view it. That would be my...
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Frikkie. I much appreciated. I think I'm going to latch on that and say that we all need to be drivers in some form, drivers of transformation, drivers within our own personal lives, even in the workplace. So I definitely agree with you, Frikkie. We need to bring it back home and also talk about these topics. To our viewers out there, we definitely happy that you managed to join us, and we hope you found this session quite valuable in terms of listening to what we have to talk about and employment equity. Please look out for our next episode. We are going to be talking about a very important topic, and do join us in our session in our next podcast recording. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you very much.